Hey everybody, I'm coming to you from the backyard of my home in my little writing shed, trying to stay warm on this cold March coronavirus infested day. So, I wanted to talk to you today a little bit about Kafka's Metamorphosis, and I wanted to begin by discussing briefly his bio. Kafka was born in 1883 and he died in 1924. So he only lived to 40. He was German speaking Bohemian, and Bohemia is what is now sort of the western part of the Czech Republic. He was Jewish. He became a lawyer and wrote in his spare time, as is the case oftentimes with authors. They have full time jobs and do other things. He dies of tuberculosis at 40 years old. We would probably say that's a tragedy. He never married. And I don't know if you had a chance to read the introduction of your book, but I think it's worth at least reading the first paragraph to you here. This is in the first page of the introduction. While he lived, Franz Kafka was an obscure writer of short novels. When he died, he became the body of works that has created our modern awareness. The metamorphosis of history by Kafka and of Kafka by his art is the most dramatic evidence of the power of literature since the Romantic movement. Whoa. That's quite a statement. And I would also say I'm not sure that I could think of a more depressing, quintessentially existentialist description of a person's life. That while he lived in relative obscurity, and his works were relatively obscure. But in his death, he became one of the most influential writers of the 20th century. Now, it's also a bit ironic that Kafka, as he was dying, had written one of his friends, who is going to essentially be the executor of his will and in charge of his estate. He wrote his friend and asked him to destroy all of his works, all of his unpublished things. We only have what we have of Kafka now because his friend essentially did not listen to Kafka's own words. So if we're going to talk about existentialism again, we're going to talk about the angst and the dread, as we will in a moment, of the existentialist movement. How ironic also that his words held no power over his friend to do anything that his friend in his free will chose not to do. His friend decided to ignore that, and because his friend ignored his own wishes, we now have what we have of Kafka's works. In fact, his greatest works, most scholars consider to be those that were not published and that were published posthumously. So thank you, Kafka's friend, for ignoring everything he said. Now, as you know, many of you have probably finished the novella, Metamorphosis. It's strange. It's really, really strange. But I will say, as with many existentialist works, many works of this period, works of fiction, they're strange for a reason. And you might even have heard the adjectival form Kafkaesque. So his works are so strange that he even gets an adjective named after him. And the definition of that adjective is something that is characteristic of, or reminiscent of the oppressive or nightmarish qualities of Franz Kafka's fictional world. So if you describe something as being Kafkaesque, it is that it is characteristic or reminiscent of something that's oppressive or nightmarish. So may you too be blessed with an adjective named after you that means something like oppressive or nightmarish. But why the weirdness? Why the surrealism? Well, I think the effect of the weirdness and of the surrealism of a man turning into an insect is that it is disquieting. It's jarring. It's disconcerting. Such an approach to literature disrupts the norm. It challenges our preconceptions. It forces us to confront the uncanny, the strange, the alien. And by so doing, authors like Kafka force us out of our comfort zone. And they, at times, then also through this approach to literature, shock us into some sort of confrontation with some of the deepest questions of human existence. In fact, Kafka especially explores existential anxiety in the absurdist, surrealist tale that you read this week, The Metamorphosis. And as you can imagine, it's quite sensible that authors of the early 20th century were exploring the meaning of existence, given everything that they encountered in the destruction and terror of for Kafka, the war to end all wars, World War I. And as you know, as students of history, it was in fact not the war to end all wars. I even wonder sometimes what sort of works Kafka would have written had he lived another 15 years to see the Second World War. As just a side note, too, think of what Gregor Samsa is turned into. He's turned into an insect-type creature. Kafka himself was Jewish. Think of the rhetoric that comes about via Hitler and the Third Reich during the Second World War, that Jews are insects and that they are an infestation. And think of also today how that language is used to talk about illegal immigrants in our nation as an infestation. That is not uncommon. That is not new rhetoric. That is something that is age old, but was particularly made popular and powerfully used by Hitler and the Third Reich. Now, it's after the Second World War that we really begin to see a considerable number of existentialist thinkers emerge. In fact, some scholars will not consider these earlier authors, existentialist authors. The 40s and 50s is really that time where we start to see the emergence of the so-called existentialist thinkers and writers. For example, someone like a Jean-Paul Sartre or Heidegger. Now, one of the things the so-called existentialist writers like Soren Kierkegaard is another existentialist writer, Sartre as mentioned, Nietzsche and Kafka, one of the things they're known for is prodding what has come to be known as the existential angst. And that's the state that one exists in when he or she has come to accept the seemingly meaningless nature of what they see as an absurd, uncaring world. So the world doesn't care. There's no meaning in it. We've seen mass execution, mass death, mass loss of life in war. We've seen the progress of man lead us to the apex of society, which is apparently the creation of technology to destroy ourselves. They can't go for Leibowitz. And the world doesn't care. The universe just doesn't care. So now what do we do if we accept that as a truth? What do we do with that reality, that everything is meaningless? That state of wrestling with that and trying to make sense of that is called the existential angst. And so you might not be surprised to know that existentialists are concerned with some pretty heavy themes, things like finitude. We all have an end. Death is that end. Guilt, anxiety, and suffering. What do we do with suffering, and what meaning do we make of suffering? Now, existentialists often respond to this position of meaninglessness in one of two ways. There's despair, and there's also hope. So if you read an author like a Camus, and that's spelled C-A-M-U-S, I used to mispronounce words that I had never heard pronounced before. One of the most embarrassing ones for me was, as an undergrad, I raised my hand in a philosophy class and I said, I don't understand what this paradigm is. And you might laugh at that because the word is paradigm and there's a G in there. And there are reasons for that, but come on, English. Come on. But Camus is pronounced Camus, but spelled C-A-M-U-S. If you read any Camus, for instance, his novel The Plague, which might be a little too soon, might hit a bit too close to home right now, you will find an example of that sort of existentialist despair. Right, so despair or hope, and here is despair. But if you turn to someone like a Soren Kierkegaard, you'll find an example of someone who comes to a certain level of hope in the midst of acknowledging that this life is absurd. Now, back to the Metamorphosis. By transforming Gregor into this scarab-like, beetle-like creature, Kafka follows a long history of literary genius, where I'm thinking here of Ovid and the Metamorphosis, where the author seeks to disorient us in order to force us as individual subjects to explore our own existence and the role our own free will plays in such. And so I wanted to leave you here with some questions that you, I think, should think about as you wrestle through what's going on with Kafka's tale, why a beetle, who would write something like this, and what's the point of it. So here are some questions. One, does Gregor have free will? If so, how does he exercise it? And if not, what does this mean for his life? So that's number one. Number two, what is the meaning of his transformation? Make meaning of that. By this I mean, what things does he learn? And could he only learn such things because of his dramatic transformation? Three, while Gregor most clearly metamorphosizes, and I believe that is a word, in the story, are there other transformations? So he's the most obvious metamorphosis. But are there other metamorphoses? For instance, what of his father? What of his mother? Or his sister Greta? And then 4, what do you make of the final scene of the novella, where we have this happy family finally removed of their burden, who has plans to move to a less expensive flat and are now imagining the promising future of the beautiful, talented Greta, who's getting her color back. So those are some questions for you to wrestle with. We hope you enjoy this weird story and begin exploring for yourself what the important things of life are and what role your free will has in pursuing them. See you guys.